African Americans have been present in America since its earliest days, yet their foundational contributions are largely excluded from mainstream historical narratives. When we think about the birth of the United States, familiar names quickly come to mind: figures celebrated in textbooks, monuments, and national holidays. But beneath those well-known stories lies another history, one that has been quietly pushed aside. A history written not in grand speeches or signed documents, but in labor, resistance, sacrifice, and survival. From the moment America began to take shape, African Americans were already here, building its cities, fueling its economy, and fighting in its wars. They were present at the docks, on the battlefields, in the workshops, and behind the scenes of the nation's most defining moments. Yet generation after generation grew up learning a version of history where these contributions barely existed. If they were mentioned at all, this absence was not accidental. It made the story simpler, more comfortable, and easier to celebrate. But it also left out a deeper truth. America was shaped by people whose names were rarely written down, whose voices were often ignored, and whose impact cannot be erased no matter how hard history tried. In this video, we are going to uncover that hidden foundation, not to rewrite history, but to complete it. Because understanding who was excluded from the story helps us understand how the nation truly came to be and why so many struggles continue today. If you believe history should be honest, inclusive, and grounded in truth, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring forward stories that deserve to be told, remembered, and understood. Stay with us because the history you are about to hear changes everything you thought you knew about America. The story we have begun to uncover does not stop at the moment America imagined itself as a nation. As the colonies moved toward open rebellion against British rule, African Americans were already woven into every layer of that struggle, even though their presence would later be pushed to the edges of memory. The American Revolution is often remembered as a fight over liberty and self-determination. Yet for thousands of African Americans, it was also a moment of painful contradiction, a war fought in the name of freedom within a society that denied them their own. When the first shots of the revolution rang out, African Americans did not stand apart as passive observers. They were there, in port cities and rural towns, listening carefully to the promises being made. Words like liberty and natural rights carried enormous weight for people who lived under bondage or discrimination. For many, the revolution represented a rare opening, a chance to pursue freedom in a world that had long closed its doors to them. Some chose to fight alongside colonial forces, believing that service and sacrifice might earn them a place in the new nation being imagined. Others weighed different paths, searching for any opportunity that might lead them out of slavery and toward autonomy. On the battlefields, African Americans served in both integrated and segregated units, depending on the colony and the moment in the war. They marched, carried supplies, stood guard, and fought under the same dangerous conditions as white soldiers. Away from the front lines, countless others supported the war effort through labor that kept armies moving, preparing food, repairing equipment, tending to the wounded, and transporting goods across long and treacherous distances. These roles were rarely celebrated, yet without them, military campaigns would have collapsed under their own weight. Beyond visible labor and combat, African Americans also moved through the war in quieter, more strategic ways. Their familiarity with local terrain, towns, and households allowed some to gather information that was otherwise inaccessible. In an era when movement was tightly controlled and suspicion was everywhere, black men and women could sometimes travel unnoticed, carrying knowledge that shaped decisions and altered outcomes. Their contributions, though largely undocumented, were part of the invisible framework that sustained the revolutionary cause. At the same time, the chaos of war disrupted the rigid structures of colonial society. Enslaved people seized moments of uncertainty to escape, negotiate, or redefine their circumstances. The revolution fractured old certainties, and African Americans navigated that instability with remarkable awareness, making choices that balanced risk, survival, and hope. Each decision reflected a deep understanding of the limits and possibilities of a world in transition. Yet when the war ended and independence was secured, the promises of the revolution narrowed. The new nation celebrated victory, while many African Americans found themselves returned to old conditions or pushed into new forms of exclusion. Their sacrifices had helped secure freedom for the colonies, but freedom itself remained unevenly distributed. Still, their presence during the revolution left an undeniable mark. They challenged the meaning of liberty by embodying its contradictions, and in doing so, they laid the groundwork for future struggles that would continue to question who the nation truly belonged to. The American Revolution was not only a war of independence. It was a moment when African Americans asserted their humanity in a society that often refused to acknowledge it. Their actions did not end in justice, but they reshaped the story of the nation in ways that cannot be undone, even if history tried to forget them. As the revolution unfolded and African Americans moved through its uncertainties, certain lives came to embody both the promise and the contradiction of the era. Among them were Crispus Attucks and Peter Salem, two men whose actions placed them at the center of defining moments in the struggle for independence. Even as history would later push their names into the margins, their stories do not stand apart from the broader narrative we have been tracing. Instead, they give it a human face, revealing how ideals of freedom collided with lived reality. Crispus Attucks entered the story before the war had fully begun, at a moment when tension in the colonies was already reaching a breaking point. Living and working along Boston's waterfront, he inhabited a world shaped by labor, surveillance, and restricted movement, conditions familiar to many people of African descent in colonial America. On the night of the Boston Massacre, Attucks stood among those who confronted British soldiers, not as a symbol chosen by history, but as an ordinary man responding to extraordinary pressure. When the shots were fired and Attucks fell, his death transformed him into something larger than himself. He became the first person killed in the conflict that would lead to independence. A powerful reminder that the cost of resistance was not theoretical. Yet as the revolution was later remembered, his name faded while others were elevated, even though his sacrifice helped ignite the very movement that claimed to speak in the name of liberty. Years later, on a battlefield thick with smoke and confusion, Peter Salem's moment arrived. Enslaved at the war's outset, Salem entered the conflict carrying the weight of a system that denied him ownership of his own life. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, he stood among colonial forces facing one of the most formidable armies in the world. In the chaos of combat, his actions contributed directly to a turning point that reshaped how the war was perceived, demonstrating that British forces were not invincible. Witnesses remembered Salem's courage, and for a brief time, recognition followed. His service earned him freedom, yet freedom did not guarantee security, prosperity, or lasting honor. Like many black veterans, Salem returned to a society that had little place for him beyond the battlefield, his wartime contributions acknowledged only in fragments. Together, Attucks and Salem reveal a pattern that runs through the revolution and beyond. African Americans were present at moments of crisis, willing to risk everything for ideals that promised change. But those ideals were unevenly applied once victory was secured. Their participation exposed a central contradiction. A revolution fought for freedom that depended on people who were denied it, while their actions challenged that contradiction. The nation that emerged was not ready to resolve it. The neglect of their stories was not simply an oversight. It reflected a deeper discomfort with what their lives represented. To fully remember Crispus Attucks and Peter Salem is to confront the reality that African Americans were not passive beneficiaries of American independence, nor were they outsiders to its creation. They were active participants whose sacrifices shaped the nation at its most fragile stage. Their lives force us to reconsider whose courage is celebrated and whose is quietly set aside. By restoring Attucks and Salem to the narrative, we begin to see the revolution not as a single, unified struggle, but as a layered and contested one. Their stories bridge the broader experiences we have explored, connecting collective action to individual lives, and reminding us that history is not only made by those who write it, but also by those who lived it at great personal cost. As the war moved toward its conclusion, and the idea of independence shifted from rebellion to governance, the presence of African Americans did not disappear from the story. It simply became quieter, less visible, and more easily ignored. While celebrated figures debated the future of the nation, African Americans, both enslaved and free, continued to shape that future through labor that was considered ordinary at the time, yet proved essential in hindsight. The transition from revolution to nation building relied not only on political ideals, but on physical work, skilled craftsmanship, and constant maintenance, much of which fell on black hands. In Philadelphia, where the foundations of the new government would be laid, Independence Hall rose as a symbol of democratic aspiration. What is rarely emphasized is how that building came to exist in the first place. Enslaved African Americans performed much of the heavy labor required to construct, repair, and maintain the structure. They hauled materials, prepared workspaces, and carried out tasks that allowed others the freedom to think, debate, and write. Their labor created the physical environment in which the Constitution could be discussed, even though they themselves were excluded from the conversations taking place inside. Free African Americans were also part of this world of construction and preparation. Skilled black artisans, carpenters, and laborers contributed their expertise to the buildings and infrastructure that supported the Constitutional Convention. Their work demanded precision and knowledge, yet it was rarely recorded in the same way as political speeches or signed documents. This absence from the written record did not reflect a lack of importance, but rather the limits of whose contributions were considered worthy of preservation. As delegates gathered to argue over representation, rights, and the balance of power, the daily operations that made such discussions possible continued in the background. Meals were prepared, rooms were cleaned, materials were moved, and the environment was kept functional. African Americans were present in these spaces, witnessing debates about liberty while living under systems that denied them legal recognition as full participants in the nation. The contrast between the ideals being articulated and the realities unfolding around them could not have been lost on those whose labor sustained the process. The Constitution that emerged from these debates carried that contradiction forward. It spoke of governance and order, while embedding compromises that reflected existing hierarchies. African Americans, whose work supported the drafting process, found themselves defined within the document in abstract and limiting ways, counted for representation but denied agency. Their labor had helped bring the Constitution into existence, yet the Constitution did not extend its promises equally in return. This moment connects directly to the earlier sacrifices we have explored. Just as African Americans fought in the Revolution without guaranteed freedom, they also helped build the structures of the new nation without assurance of inclusion. Their contributions were foundational, yet deliberately understated. The nation's most enduring symbol of democracy stands, in part, because of people who were never meant to be seen as architects of that democracy. By recognizing the labor behind Independence Hall and the drafting of the Constitution, the story of America becomes more complete and more honest. It reveals that nation building was not only an intellectual exercise carried out by a few prominent figures, but a collective effort sustained by many whose names were omitted. African Americans were not distant from the creation of American democracy. They were physically and materially embedded in it. Even as the system they helped support struggled to recognize their humanity. As the walls of Independence Hall sheltered debate and decision-making, a quieter reality unfolded alongside the birth of American governance. African Americans, whose labor had sustained both the revolution and the nation-building that followed, remained deliberately separated from the political process shaping their future. The ideals discussed inside those chambers spoke of representation and consent. Yet the people whose lives were most affected by those decisions were absent from the table. This exclusion was not incidental. It was carefully woven into the framework of the new government. When the Constitution took shape, it did so through compromise, negotiation, and calculated silence. African Americans were neither invited to participate nor recognized as full members of the political community. Enslaved people were denied legal personhood altogether, while free African Americans faced barriers that effectively kept them outside the political sphere. Property requirements, restrictive local laws, and social hostility ensured that participation remained limited to a narrow segment of the population. The nation was being defined, but not everyone was allowed to help define it. The most striking example of this contradiction appeared in the 3/5 Compromise. In an effort to balance power between states, enslaved African Americans were counted as a fraction of a person for purposes of representation. Even though they possessed no political rights of their own, this provision transformed human lives into numerical tools, increasing political influence for those who held power while offering nothing in return to those being counted. It was a decision rooted in pragmatism rather than principle, and it revealed how deeply inequality was embedded in the nation's foundations. This moment cannot be separated from the stories already told. African Americans had fought in the Revolution, contributed labor to the construction of democratic spaces, and witnessed firsthand the language of liberty being elevated to national importance. Yet when that language was formalized into law, it stopped short of recognizing them as participants. The Constitution preserved existing hierarchies even as it promised a new political order, reflecting a nation unwilling to fully confront the meaning of its own ideals. For those excluded, this reality shaped daily life in profound ways. Laws were passed, taxes levied, and policies enforced without their consent or representation. Political decisions determined the conditions under which they lived and worked. Yet they had no recognized voice in those decisions. The promise of self-governance existed, but it was selectively applied, creating a system where democracy and exclusion coexisted side by side. Over time, the consequences of these early choices became deeply rooted. The Constitution's silence on equal political participation allowed states to construct systems that reinforced racial hierarchy long after independence was secured. What began as compromise hardened into precedent, shaping generations of policy and practice. African Americans were expected to uphold the laws of a nation that had not fully acknowledged them as part of its political body. Yet this exclusion did not erase awareness or resistance. African Americans understood the contradiction at the heart of the system and carried that understanding forward. The Constitution, flawed as it was, also became a site of challenge and reinterpretation. Its language, once used to justify inequality, would later be invoked to demand inclusion. The same document that institutionalized exclusion would become a battleground for redefining citizenship and rights. This chapter of the story underscores a central truth. American democracy did not begin as a finished project. It was constructed with limits, shaped by fear, compromise, and equal power. African Americans were present at its creation, yet deliberately pushed to the margins of political life. Their exclusion was not a failure of participation, but a reflection of a system unwilling to recognize them as equals. Understanding this tension allows us to see the Constitution not as a flawless starting point, but as the beginning of an unfinished struggle over who belongs and who gets to be heard. Even after the Declaration of Independence was signed and the Constitution ratified, the promise of freedom and equality remained unevenly applied, leaving African Americans to navigate a society built on both lofty ideals and deeply entrenched exclusion. The founding of the nation marked a moment of tremendous possibility, yet for Black communities, it also signaled the continuation of systemic barriers that would shape their lives for centuries to come. Voting rights, access to education, and meaningful political representation were all arenas where the struggle for inclusion became immediate and unrelenting, as the structures designed to uphold democracy often worked against those who had helped create it. The passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870, which granted African American men the legal right to vote, was a milestone in theory, but the reality on the ground told a different story. States quickly implemented measures designed to undermine the amendment's impact. Literacy tests that were deliberately confusing, poll taxes that made participation economically impossible for many, and intimidation tactics that instilled fear in communities attempting to exercise their legal rights. In the decades following Reconstruction, these strategies effectively excluded African Americans from the political process, demonstrating that legal recognition alone could not guarantee meaningful inclusion. Even those who were technically allowed to participate often found themselves marginalized within systems engineered to preserve existing hierarchies. Education followed a similar pattern. Schools for Black children were systematically underfunded and under-resourced, leaving generations without access to quality instruction or the tools necessary to thrive in a rapidly modernizing nation. The Supreme Court's 1896 ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson cemented the doctrine of separate but equal, legitimizing a dual education system that was inherently unequal, even when laws made desegregation decades later. In cases like Brown, Board of Education, the practical reality remained that schools serving African American communities often lagged far behind their counterparts in facilities, funding, and opportunities. In classrooms where students struggled against these disparities, the legacy of exclusion persisted, reinforcing the cycle of limited political and social mobility. Political representation mirrored these struggles in complexity and persistence. African Americans were legally barred from holding office in many areas, and when they gained entry, they often faced systemic obstacles designed to dilute their influence. Gerrymandering, voter roll purges, and selective enforcement of laws continued to undermine participation well into the 20th century. These challenges revealed a society unwilling to extend full citizenship and equal voice to those who had been most essential to its creation. The fight for political agency became not just a question of voting, but a broader struggle for recognition, respect, and the ability to shape the policies that governed daily life. Across voting, education, and representation, African Americans displayed remarkable resilience. Communities organized schools, literacy programs, and civic initiatives to counteract structural barriers, ensuring that knowledge, culture, and political consciousness survived despite legal and social repression. Activism became a multi-generational effort, linking the sacrifices of revolutionary soldiers and laborers who built the nation with the ongoing fight for inclusion and justice. In this way, the struggle after the nation's founding was not separate from the revolution. It was a continuation of the same effort to claim the freedoms and rights that had been promised in theory, but withheld in practice. This persistent struggle demonstrates that the story of American democracy cannot be fully understood without acknowledging those who were forced to fight for it long after independence. African Americans' efforts to overcome systemic barriers to voting, education, and representation illuminate both the limitations of the nation's founding ideals and the enduring determination of a people committed to shaping a more equitable society, ensuring that their presence and their rights could never again be ignored. As African Americans continued to navigate a nation that had been built with both their labor and their exclusion in mind, the challenges they faced extended far beyond politics and voting rights. Economic discrimination, unequal schooling, and biased criminal justice practices became interconnected mechanisms that sustained racial inequality across generations. Creating barriers that were both visible and insidiously hidden, these forces shaped daily life, determining who could own property, attend school, or even move freely without fear of systemic oppression. And they ensured that the promise of the revolution remained incomplete for those whose efforts had helped make it possible. Economic discrimination began with the immediate aftermath of emancipation, as formerly enslaved people sought to establish livelihoods in a society structured to limit their opportunities. Sharecropping, tenant farming, and low-wage labor became common avenues for survival, often trapping families in cycles of debt and dependence. Even as industrialization created new jobs in cities, African Americans were frequently relegated to the least desirable positions, excluded from unions, and paid less than white workers for the same work. This economic marginalization was not incidental. It was reinforced by policies that restricted access to land ownership, business loans, and professional opportunities, ensuring that wealth and stability remained largely concentrated elsewhere. Generations grew up with these limitations, inheriting not only the effects of discrimination, but also the social and psychological burden of living in a society where their labor was valued but their rights were constrained. Education, which should have been a vehicle for upward mobility, often reinforced these inequalities. Schools serving African American communities were chronically underfunded, overcrowded, and lacking in basic resources, perpetuating disparities in literacy, achievement, and future prospects. Even landmark rulings like Brown v. Board of Education could not instantly erase decades of systemic neglect, and many students continued to face inadequate facilities, overworked teachers, and curricula that ignored their history and culture. The connection between education and economic opportunity meant that these disparities extended beyond classrooms, influencing access to skilled professions, higher education, and generational advancement. The criminal justice system further compounded these inequalities, operating as a structure that disproportionately targeted African Americans and reinforced social and economic disadvantage. Discriminatory policing, harsher sentencing, and biased jury selection created a cycle in which individuals and families were repeatedly subjected to legal and social penalties. Incarceration disrupted communities, limited employment opportunities, and strained familial structures, while public perception and policy often justified these outcomes with narratives that obscured systemic causes. These practices were not isolated. They intersected with economic and educational disadvantages, making it increasingly difficult for African Americans to achieve social mobility and full participation in civic life. Together, these factors illustrate a continuity of struggle that links the revolutionary era to the present. The sacrifices of African Americans during the Revolution, the labor that built Independence Hall, and the courage of those who challenged exclusionary systems all find echoes in later generations' fight against economic, educational, and legal oppression. The injustices may have evolved in form, but the underlying structures that limited access to freedom, prosperity, and agency persisted, shaping the contours of American life for centuries. Despite these systemic barriers, resilience and resistance remained constant. Communities developed networks of mutual support, established institutions, and nurtured leaders who could advocate for change. Activism in labor, education, and criminal justice reform became an extension of the struggle first embodied by African Americans during the Revolution. linking historical sacrifices to contemporary efforts for justice. Understanding these intertwined forces reveals that racial inequality in America is not simply the result of individual acts of prejudice, but a deeply rooted, multi-generational system. Recognizing this continuity allows us to see both the magnitude of the challenge and the enduring strength of a people committed to pursuing equality, opportunity, and the full realization of the freedoms they helped to secure. As we reflect on the journey of African Americans from the earliest days of the colonies to the present, it becomes clear that their contributions are not merely footnotes or side stories, they are central to the very fabric of American history. From fighting in the Revolution to building the physical and political structures of the nation. From challenging exclusionary laws to resisting systemic discrimination, African Americans have shaped the United States in ways that textbooks have too often ignored. Recognizing their role does more than correct historical omissions. It fundamentally reshapes how we understand the nation itself, transforming it from a story of triumph neatly concluded in 1776 to a complex, ongoing struggle for justice, equality, and inclusion. The courage and resilience demonstrated across generations reveal a pattern of persistent advocacy for rights that were promised but frequently withheld. Each battle fought on the battlefield, in labor, in education, in politics, and within the justice system connects directly to the next, creating a continuum of activism and determination. By tracing this through line, we begin to see that American democracy is not a finished achievement handed down from a few founding figures, but a living, evolving process that requires constant engagement, critique, and renewal. The accomplishments of African Americans in shaping the country's identity, culture, and institutions demand acknowledgement not only as a moral imperative, but as a vital lens through which we can better understand the nation's past and its ongoing challenges. Honoring these contributions also provides a powerful reminder for today's audiences. Equality is not an abstract ideal, but a goal that must be pursued actively, collectively, and persistently. Each act of recognition, each story shared, each lesson learned from history strengthens our understanding of how inclusion can reshape communities and society as a whole. By reframing history through the lens of African American contributions, we see that the fight for representation, fairness, and human dignity is not a chapter that closed centuries ago. It is a living narrative that continues to unfold in classrooms, courtrooms, workplaces, and communities across the country. As we conclude this exploration, I want to thank you for taking the time to engage with this story, to reflect on a history that has been overlooked for far too long, and to recognize the resilience and influence of African Americans in shaping the nation we live in today. If this video has helped you gain a new perspective, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, so that together we can continue uncovering the stories that matter, shining a light on histories that deserve to be told, and inspiring a deeper understanding of the struggle for equality in America. Your support ensures that these important narratives reach more people. Fostering awareness, education, and meaningful dialogue. History is not static, and neither is justice. By remembering, acknowledging, and sharing these stories, we contribute to a more accurate, inclusive, and hopeful vision of the United States, one in which the ongoing struggle for equality is recognized, celebrated, and continued by each new generation. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being part of this journey toward understanding, awareness, and change.